So if you watched my video the yesterday that I put out about e-viewing and Riri Williams and the whole thing at Marvel, this video is a follow-up to that of sorts. It is a debate with actual lapsed comic skater Victor Bello, who used to run the YouTube channel VKTR Official. He's active on Twitter. His link will be in the description below. And this was a discussion that he and I had about e-viewing and Comicsgate and whatever else you want to throw in there. This discussion was overall, I didn't realize it until I started cutting it up into little pieces, but it's like 4 hours long. And each segment will be roughly an hour long on my channel. It will not, there will not necessarily be any rhyme or reason to how they're cut up. It will just be roughly in 1 hour segments. I cut out the first 20 minutes or so of this video where Victor was more explaining himself and sort of going over what he thinks and what he believes, and then there were some technical issues at the beginning. I will admit that if you watch all of these streams in a row, that there were times when I just flat out could not hear Victor. I don't know exactly what was going on. I mentioned it a few times in the stream. I don't know if those come through too well on the audio or not, but there were just flat out times when I was having audio issues on my end. So if there are times when it seems like I'm just simply not answering the question, it's because I really didn't hear what he said, and I'm just trying to answer it as best as I can. Which seems like kind of a cop-out, but I think that this overall discussion was really interesting. I'm glad I had it. I'm glad for Victor for inviting me on his Twitch stream, which that link will also be in the description below if you want to see the full thing unedited. Yeah, this stream was, I think, very enlightening. If you're a very, very diehard comic skater, you're going to hear some things that you're not going to like. If you're an anti-comic skater, you're going to hear some things that you're not going to like. This was, I think, a discussion between two very reasonable people. I hope I came off as reasonable anyway. I think Victor very much did. So this is part one, and then parts 2, 3, and 4 will follow shortly. Okay.
I can hear you right now.
Well, only took 5 minutes, but I really don't use Discord that much, so I don't know how much that was my fault and how much was technical difficulties. Hard to tell, but
well, I guess it doesn't matter in the end. Glad to have you.
Yeah, it's good to hear your voice. It really brings me back when all this stuff was fun and not fraught with factionalism and infighting.
Yeah, you are 100% right. I miss those days, honestly. So, if you don't mind, can we just get right in?
Yeah, no problem. Already taken enough time.
All right. So I have a few critiques of your video, which I think was a good video. It just got a few things incorrect, like my argument. And
Okay.
before we get into that, I'd like to give a few suggestions. First of all, the title of your video.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, if you'll let me bring it up, I think you need to, if you want to make the YouTube thing work, I think you need to sensationalize your titles a little bit more. I mean, yeah, this is your title. Oh, wait, am I looking at the wrong one?
I think it was something like Riri Williams e-viewing and the laws of trust in Marvel. Something to that effect.
No, you don't do that. You say shit like freaking SJW, dude, cuck, soy boy. Come on, you want views here.
You're not wrong. I don't know. I've always tried to stay away from the sensationalism, but then again, you look at my average view count. Maybe I am doing something wrong in that regard, but
well, it's admirable. All right, so let's get into the video.
Okay.
Okay. The first point you made that I don't really feel very comfortable with is I think you mischaracterized my argument in the video that you made.
Okay.
Now, if we pull up those tweets, my argument wasn't that the only reason to be against the e-viewing thing was racism. I was in essence asking a question. Now, I'd like you to explain to me the problem with Marvel hiring this woman. Why is it a problem exactly?
So if this was the only time that Marvel had hired in the recent past with the exact same editorial team that they have right now, if it was the only time in the recent past that they had hired somebody with little to no experience writing comics, little to no evident even interest in the superhero genre, there wouldn't necessarily be a problem with it. And the reason I kept on harping on Chelsea Kane writing Mockingbird is because that's really the first example I could think of, at least in the recent past, where they have done that. With, I believe that Tom Brevoort and a lot of the people that were involved with that decision are also involved with this decision based on what I saw of the press release that Eve Ewing put out. So, is there anything wrong with hiring Eve Ewing in a vacuum? No. But the problem is that Marvel keeps hiring these people that there's no reason to believe that they know what they're doing, and they end up messing it up incredibly, and then making it just making fools of themselves. I mean, the Mockingbird "Ask Me About My Feminist Agenda" cover was a joke it's been a joke for like 2 years now. So hiring Eve Ewing, it's not at all hard to imagine that something very similar is going to happen. I mean, Eve Ewing's resume when it comes to fiction writing is very slim. But then again, it's like a lot of people that have written comics over the past 80 plus years have had relatively thin resumes. But I mean, back then, at various points, it wasn't Marvel Comics. It wasn't the top leader in the industry, whether you wanted it to be or not. So the fact that they're hiring somebody to write a pretty highly publicized #1, who has little to no experience or even evident interest in comics, it smacks of sensationalism. It smacks of stunt casting. It smacks of them just trying to show how committed they are to diversity rather than just simply telling a good story. So there is a possibility that this could work out. Eve Ewing could end up writing the next American comics classic for all we know. But given their track record and given the fact that the way that this has gone in the past, there's no reason to think that, because it doesn't seem like Tom Brevoort and the other people that are in charge of hiring at Marvel, that they know what to look for when it comes to hiring outsiders to write comics.
I think there's a valid criticism in there, or there's a lot of them, and I agree. If the argument at this point was Marvel is hiring inexperienced people, they should fish from a well of writers who have written for them countless times before, or they shouldn't be wasting. There's a good argument there, but the problem I had with the diversity in comics video was that it wasn't making any of those arguments, or at least it wasn't making them overtly. The whole video was basically a repetition of, oh my god, Marvel is hiring this black woman because she's black and has the same hairstyle, and I predicted this before. Like, okay, if I was listening to that video around 3 to 4 months ago, I would have been like, wow, oh my god, you predicted this. This is amazing. This is amazing. Wow. Like, why is Marvel doing this? And I think there are legitimate criticisms against this, but the race of the writer, I don't think that is ever a legitimate criticism of Marvel or whatever. I think I'm going to, later in this discussion, I'm going to have to pick your brains on exactly why you think Marvel has gone wrong or what's wrong with Marvel. But you can criticize the hiring decision without harping over and over again that this person who is a writer, who did display some kind of interest in the character, who does have a fan base that pushed them forward. The race should never be brought into this unless, like, personally, I think Richard really loves controversy. That's literally the only reason why race should be a factor in any of this. So what do you think about
that? So yeah, and a few months ago, I would have basically defended anything that Diversity in Comics did, regardless of the circumstances, and I'm kind of past that. So I'm not pretending that Richard Meyer is some kind of genius that always does the right thing. I think that yes, he is very, very frank. Sometimes, a lot of times, to a fault. He does his videos with little to no planning. He doesn't really think about what he's going to say. But the problem is with what you just said is that the it seems like this all started because of, and I asked you this on Twitter, it seems like this all started because of a change.org petition. And it didn't really get a lot of signatures. I mean, 2,500, that's not very many, realistically speaking. I could find change.org petitions that have hundreds of thousands, and this one only got 2,500. Yeah. But I think what actually happened is that Tom Brevoort and Alana Smith and Sana Amanat and all the other people that are in charge of actually hiring at Marvel, that they literally wanted to troll Richard Meyer and Comicsgate. But that's just speculation on my part. In any case, whatever the reason, the change.org petition, it mentions 3 or 4 reasons why you should hire e-viewing. One is because that she's very credentialed, which is true. One is that her father was some kind of graphic artist. I don't really know the details about that, but okay, I'll take it. Another is that she's a published author, but her published work doesn't really obviously correlate to the comics medium. I mean, it's a book of like poetry and sort of extemporaneous essays and some other sorts of things. So it's like, so none of the things that it mentions in that respect, none of them scream that this is obviously a person that should be writing a superhero comic. But then the fourth one it mentions, and it makes a pretty big deal about that. There's a whole paragraph in the change.org petition dedicated to this, is that it mentions that she's able to authentically represent the Black Chicago experience. So the original petition that seems to have sparked this whole thing, and maybe it didn't, maybe e-viewing was being looked at by other people well before this happened, but I don't see any evidence of that being alleged by anybody. But if I'm correct about that the original change.org petition was what started this, it mentions her race as a big factor, and that the fact that she is from Chicago, she's very intelligent. Can't take that away from her. She's very intelligent. She kind of sort of looks like Riri Williams if you look at pictures of her, but not really. I think that to suggest that was not a factor in her hiring is really kind of shallow. I very much think that Tom Brevoort, and I keep bringing him up because she mentions him quite a bit in the press release that she released for when she got hired for this. She talks about how much Brevoort helped her. So I'm assuming that he was one of the big supporters of this kind of thing, and we know that Brevoort is one of these guys that he's a white liberal. He wants to basically show how woke he is. He wants to show how progressive he is, and I think that it's really kind of. I think it's completely fair to assume that her race and her background, being raised in Chicago, was a big factor in her being hired. It's not the only factor, but I think it was a significant factor. And so I think that's where that comes from, and I'm just, if that is in fact the case, then that becomes a legitimate reason to criticize her hiring. It's like if they really only hired, well, if one of the big reasons they hired this woman was because she looked like Riri and she sort of superficially resembled Ironheart, then that becomes a legitimate element to criticize her.
All right, I think this is where you and I disagree. A while ago,
okay,
I think a few months ago, I would have agreed that it's not necessary to get someone of the same race or the same background or the same ethnicity to write a character to make the character interesting. And if we're talking about making a character interesting, if that's the only concern here, then of course you don't need e-viewing to write the character. But when it comes to authenticity, that is the point where I have to completely disagree with you. Now, Richard floats this idea that any writer can write any character from any background as long as he does a little bit of research. And while I do believe that is true, I believe any writer can make any character entertaining if what you're looking for as the SJWs, as we like to call them, is actual authenticity. Telling a story that connects to people's experiences at the moment. I don't think that's something you can gain from interviewing 1 or 2 people or 100 people or 1,000 people. Like, here's an example. Sina Grace wrote Iceman as an asshole. I think we can both agree on that.
Right.
Thinking back to that, Iceman is basically a self-insert character for Cena Grace. I can imagine that Cena Grace had very religious parents who insisted on praying the gay away, and
Right.
you can see Cena projecting a lot of that frustration onto the character, because Iceman doesn't treat his parents with any respect. He disrespects them in future. He insults them, and when his other clone future guy, whatever that ice young version of Iceman was, you could see uh, Cena Grace through the character of Iceman discouraging uh, the younger version of himself from building any kind of relationship with the parents. Now, I don't think this is a good way to tell a story of a gay person, but it's authentic, if authenticity is what you're going for. Now, I don't believe that that authenticity alone can carry the story or can carry a book in general, but Marvel are trying to do something, and so far they're succeeding in doing that thing. The one thing they aren't succeeding is, how do I say, aligning this political belief that they have, or this political agenda, as you said, and I would like you to explain that a bit later. But what they have to do, and this is my current opinion, isn't what they have to do is align something people would like to read with I don't know if I'm doing a good job of explaining myself, but Cena Grace has something to say, but he needs to say it in a good story. Now, for the e-viewing thing, I'm a bit conflicted on this. I don't necessarily support her. Okay, I don't necessarily think it's a good idea to hire her, and there are many reasons for that. It's the whole race thing that really bothered me. But since we can agree that Richard isn't exactly a paragon of virtue or intelligence, I think I can scrap most of my notes here. What I want to ask you this is this: you spoke about the Mockingbird. Ask me about my feminist agenda. What is wrong with that?
So I actually I've read the first issue of that series and the last issue, the one with the actual infamous cover. And Chelsea Kane writes Mockingbird as this incredibly self-righteous, arrogant, ball-busting character that just doesn't take crap from anybody, and there's nothing like admirable about her. She's just really arrogant. She's just always portrayed as being in the right. She's just always portrayed as I don't know, just people talk or feminists talk about male power fantasies when they talk about superheroes. Chelsea Kane's Mockingbird is almost a female power fantasy, and it's kind of really ugly that she's just constantly constantly comparing herself to men, constantly trying to show up the people around her, constantly trying to talk compare herself to these other superheroes that have come in the past. Um, so the series itself, from what I read, was just it wasn't the kind of thing that had mass appeal. It might have had very niche appeal, but the problem is that Mockingbird has been around since the mid '70s. She has a 40+ year history, and Chelsea Kane apparently ignored all of that to kind of put an idealized version of herself in the comic. And people didn't respond to it favorably at all when it first came out, and when that last issue with the Joelle Jones cover, asked me about my feminist agenda. Like, by the time that came out, I wasn't reading comics. I had gotten out of comics because of just what I saw as this very, very progressive agenda that I just didn't want to be a part of. But I still knew about that cover just because of how ham-fisted it was, and just because of how much of a joke it was. And I'm really afraid that Marvel is setting e-viewing up for failure, that she's going to, because of her lack of understanding of the medium, because of her lack of understanding of the history of the characters, that there's a high probability that there is going to be some element of her comic that is going to be just as meme-worthy as the Ask Me About My Feminist Agenda shirt.
Okay. Now, what I want to know specifically, do you think there's anything wrong with the specific Ask Me About My Feminist Agenda shirt? Like, I see a lot of people complain about this, and when I sat down to think about it, I don't really see anything wrong with a shirt like that. what exactly is wrong with putting a message like that? I understand you think it's a it's them ham-fisting some kind of political ideology, but what exactly is wrong with it in general?
Well, for one thing, you're just sort of taunting all of the people that are complaining about the fact that you have this ham-fisted political agenda. And so when you're trying to troll people, don't be surprised when you get trolled back. But in the context of the story, it actually almost becomes worse because it actually does appear in the issue. And basically, issue 8 was the last issue, and it got canceled for low sales, so it didn't even get to 12 issues, which is where you can get 2 full trade paperbacks. And so the Ask Me About My Feminist Agenda shirt kind of appears towards the end of that issue. And it's just sort of an FU to all the fans that didn't like her portrayal of this character. But you really can't complain when, you know, you were asked into this medium by people that admittedly did not have your best interest at heart. In this case, Tom Brevoort and Brian Michael Bendis, who was Chelsea Kane's friend. Sorry. And so it's just kind of a deliberately antagonistic thing that if you have any problem with ham-fisted feminist agendas at all in fiction, we're just not going to care about you. We're saying that we don't feel that your criticism is valid.
Okay, this is what's going to happen right now. I'm going to take the role of the quote-unquote SJW, and I'm going to try and explain to you exactly why I think you're wrong in the whole the agenda. Like, you think the whole feminist agenda thing is bad, right? You said Chelsea Kane wrote Mockingbird as a bitchy, annoying character who was constantly trying to show up men. That's what you said, right?
Yeah, more or less.
Well, okay. Over the past month, I've gained a lot of sympathy for the quote unquote SJW position, and I feel generally anti-SJW movements don't do the critiques they have or the points they have any justice. Like, if you follow people like Sargon of Akkad, Andy Warski, or the general skeptic community, you see something that they do. They pick a blue-haired, obnoxious feminist who's doing something obviously stupid. They basically strip her down and quote-unquote destroy her, and then they claim victory over feminism in general. Well, I've grown really irritated with this, should I call it tactic or whatever, because they aren't actually engaging with the actual ideas that these people have. So when it comes to this Mockingbird thing, in fiction, there are certain positive male attributes and, positive female attributes, right?
Okay.
Now, when you go for positive male attributes, you have things like strength, physical strength most of the time. You have things like integrity. You have things like charisma. You have very positive traits that affirm the character himself, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Now, when we go over to the female characters, as a female, what good things can be said of you as a character? Number one, you're beautiful. Why are you beautiful? For the enjoyment of some man who's probably going to rescue you, or the people currently reading the book, like Richard with his obsession with double D's or something. You can be kind, which is a motherly instinct, which you can be kind, you can be compassionate, you can be hot, you can be beautiful. None of these things like make a female character stand on her own. She's always in relation to some male character. Like, I've not read much of Spider-Man, but you don't see people like Mary Jane, or correct me if I'm wrong about this, but you don't see them like living their own lives. I understand Mary Jane and all these characters are secondary characters, but every good thing you can say about female characters in comics up until now has always been in relation to some male character. Okay, she's always supporting him. She's always being a literally every good female character is good because she's very supportive, correct?
Okay.
Yeah. Here's the problem. If you're a man reading this, of course you admire these features in women, right? Every person with functioning brain cells admires a woman who's kind, compassionate, and beautiful. But while I don't think men and women have exactly identical minds, I believe we have the same drives. We want to be acknowledged for what we are, our own personal merits. We want to be understood. We want to be respected, not in relation to some other character or because of unchangeable traits like how beautiful you are. And let's face it, not every woman is beautiful. And so when every single female character is a, oh my god, Peter, you're so fantastic, or don't worry, Peter, you can do it, get up, go kick Rhino's ass, it isn't affirming for female readers who have ambitions other than being a pretty thing for men to look at. That is the critique that feminists have against how female characters have been portrayed through the years. Now, I agree, if you make a character bitchy or bossy, like, look at the language I'm using, bitchy. You don't use that for a guy. But if you go too far in making a character undesirable, I agree that that's bad. But what exactly is your argument against why they do these things?
Well, for one thing, right? I mean, nobody wants to read about that. Guys don't want to read about that. Most women don't want to read about that. I mean, too many women know the bitchy, bossy archetype at their own place of employment, and they don't want to see that represented in comics. I mean, Mockingbird, she has this 40-plus year history where she was a part of a large part of that was spent with being with the West Coast Avengers, where even though she had no powers compared to a lot of other people, she was still an equal and respected member of the team. And Chelsea Kane, her portrayal of Mockingbird acknowledges very little of that. That it's like Mockingbird was one of these people that was pretty well respected amongst the Avengers for a long time, and Chelsea Kane apparently ignored all of that exactly to fit the feminist archetype that you're talking about. So it's like, who are you writing this for? You're not writing it for the male readers that have been reading superhero comics for 10, 20, 30 years. You're not reading it for the new female writers. You're really only writing it for the new female readers that are similar in their worldview and understanding of feminism to Chelsea Kane. And that's the big problem, is that they say that they're trying to make comics more inclusive, but what ends up happening is that they make comics very, very, even more insular than they already were. And I'm not going to pretend that they haven't been insular for a long time, but I don't see this kind of philosophy catching on with the general readership.
Wait, what I think I hear you saying, what I think I'm hearing you say is this archetype of this woman, this description of a woman that I'm speaking about, the kind of woman who isn't just an extension of a male character. Men, even the female readers of the books, don't like that.
I'm not saying there's no female readers that like that. I'm saying that it's not something that there's a widespread audience for. And keep in mind, right, like I'm saying, right, Chelsea Kane was a member of the West Coast Mockingbird, Bobby Morris was a member of the West Coast Avengers for like 20 years. So she was a co-equal member of that. And even though even though she was heavily defined by her relationship to Hawkeye, she was still very well respected because of her grit and her strength and her prowess and her just general common sense. It wasn't, she wasn't some wallflower. She wasn't some character that was constantly there to affirm the men around her. She was her own character in her own right. And if you had made a series about that character, it would have actually been interesting. But Chelsea Kane, who was apparently ignorant of all that, chose not to do that. She made this very, very sort of in-your-face, arrogant version of Mockingbird that is not at all true to the spirit of how she's been portrayed for quite some time.
So what you're saying is you would be all right with a character, a mockingbird character, like you. I think you said you didn't read the whole book, so and I don't have all this history of the mockingbird story, so I probably can't call you out on anything. But if would you have a problem with Marvel basically creating a character like in the vein of what I think female characters should be? That is not primarily defined by your love interest or not having your only virtue being that you have really nice tits or that you're hot. You're okay with them creating characters and separating them from their male counterparts. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, a character like that, yeah, that would be.
So
If they had their, yeah,
so the only thing wrong with Chelsea Kane's book was that she made Mockingbird an asshole.
it was that she deliberately missed the entire history of the character, and then when fans complained about it, instead of being humble and realizing, okay, maybe I should have done more research, maybe I should have listened more to the peers, maybe I should have listened more to criticism. Instead of doing that, she just doubles down on it, right? Like I said, the My Feminist Agenda shirt, that was sort of the ultimate FU to the fans, and the fact that it hasn't gone away, the fact that it's still a lingering sort of meme at Marvel, shows that they are on her side more so than the side of the people that roundly rejected that miniseries.
Okay, then I think we're fine.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'll admit, right, because a character like Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, I'm never gonna read a Miss Marvel comic. I actually have the volume 1 downloaded onto my Kindle, and I still haven't read it to this day, even though I got it on sale. But I can kind of respect a character like that. I think that her design is dumb. I think that there's kind of a lot of things about her that are dumb, but she's taking over. I mean, the Ms. Marvel name, that's been held by multiple people, so that's not really a problem. So I can kind of, to a certain extent, I can respect characters like that. But when you're deliberately sort of trolling your fan base, like the My Feminist Agenda shirt did, I don't know, it just feels really skeevy on their part.
Well, I think here's the thing. I think this is all a problem of perspective. In Chelsea Kane's perspective, I'm sure she thinks she's portraying a true feminist icon of a character, throwing aside old tropes and building a character that women can be proud of. And then, if she imagines that's what she's doing, then of course she imagines any backlash to that as probably some sexist men who want women to go back to looking like lingerie models in books and acting incredibly stupid. I think it would be far more charitable if Comicsgate in general gave these writers, I'm not going to say a free pass, but here's the problem I have with Comicsgate. There are legitimate criticisms against these characters. Number one, they move too fast in changing their personality. That's fantastic. That's a good criticism. They adopt a more. Do you read manga?
No.
Okay, yeah, there's this genre of manga called slice of life, which the entire point of that genre is nothing. There isn't exactly a coherent plot to follow. Just a bunch of stuff happens, and then the characters interact with all the stuff that happens every single day until the season ends. So that's basically slice of life. I think a good criticism of Marvel is they are introducing slice of life elements to franchises or to a company that has been known to create action or suspense or romance stories. I think they're approaching this completely wrong. So there are good criticisms against Marvel. What I don't think is a good criticism. What I don't think is a good criticism against Marvel is this idea of forced diversity. Would you like to discuss that?
Right. So, I mean, forced diversity is stuff like Iceman, and you already talked about that, about how much of an asshole
Iceman became in the Cena Grace written series. It's like you're not there. There's elements that you can try to, in introducing diversity. I think, for one thing, I do think that diversity is a buzzword. I mean, you see the way that the media, the left wing media, especially people in like MSNBC and Slate and HuffPo and all those others, the way they use diversity, it is a very loaded word. So it's very difficult to talk about diversity as sort of a neutral idea without bringing in all this left wing ideology that has promoted the notion of diversity as an inherent good. However, diversity in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it, right? And in fact, there's a lot of studies that point to if you have a diverse group of people, they're better at solving problems than a non-diverse group of people, and stuff like that. So obviously, it's it's a neutral concept that, in a lot of situations, is a good idea. So you have to separate the idea of this, you're just simply having racial and gender diversity with the progressive version of diversity, which is that you have to have an exactly representational number of whatever the race and gender makeup of that particular group is. I mean, when I was in the Navy, there was, in some situations, there was a lot of white people, and we all had to come together to form a situation. And in other situations, there was a whole lot of non-white people that they had to come together to create a situation. So you introduce this concept of diversity. It should be something that is not a loaded word, and it's become a loaded word. So I think that when you talk about diversity in fiction, it's almost always used in the loaded sense of basically having more non-white people rather than having just a purely like representational group of people. So,
But
or
I have a problem
non-het.
with that. I actually have a problem with that. You said diversity is neutral. I think that was the word you used, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I disagree. I think diversity is a good in and of itself.
Hmm.
Here's the thing.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly how you phrased it, but uh, the idea of quotas for characters, the sound of it doesn't sound very good to the ears of anyone who is a decent human being, I think. But okay, let me connect it to this. There's this thing that Richard, and I'm sorry for making references to Richard. I think we've both
Yeah,
agreed
it's hard not to. Yeah.
honestly. But Richard always has this annoying talking point, and it's only been annoying recently because I broke with Comicsgate. It's that you should be able to connect with literally any character. Okay, you shouldn't have an issue with the race of the character or the sex of the character or whatever. As a person, you should be able to connect to other people. He says this. Well, if that's the case, then let me ask you this question. Would you complain or would you have any problem if every single character in the Marvel universe was changed to a black character?
I mean, it depends on how they were changed, I guess. Like if you had some kind of Elseworlds version where it was, the Avengers, except that they're all black, it would be an interesting exercise. I don't know if in and of itself it would be good, but if you just arbitrarily said that, Tony Stark, Captain America, Spider-Man, Carol Danvers, every single one of them is black for no real reason, well, yeah, that would be a problem. But if you were to completely rebuild a universe from scratch where they were all black, no, I can't see having a problem with it.
Yeah, but why would arbitrarily changing these characters black, why would that be a problem? I mean, we can all just join hands together and agree that from here on out, Spider-Man is a black guy. I know it's not in continuity, but let's just agree. Spider-Man is black. Why is that a problem?
So, are you saying that a black person in America has exactly the same experience in America as a white person?
Oh, we haven't gotten there yet. we are still discussing the idea that you should be able to connect with literally any character, right? So I'd like to know exactly why Tony Stark, Thor, all of these people suddenly becoming black. Should that be a problem for literally anyone?
I mean, in order to do that, you would literally have to change their characters from the ground up in most cases. So it's like you could say that there's Spider-Man is black now. Well, what you're saying is that you have this character Peter Parker that is a superficially resembles an older version of Peter Parker, but in point of fact has a completely different sort of history. Um, just simply by virtue of because this is something that a lot of anti-SJWs say that I don't really agree with, which is that, well, you have to treat people as individuals. Well, to a large extent, I can agree with that, but to say that the average person's sort of experience living in whatever country they live in, whether it's America, or whether it's the UK or whatever, to say that that's not affected by their race is pretty stupid. I mean, their race absolutely does end up mattering to their, as SJWs put it, lived experience. So if you make Tony Stark black, you're basically dealing with a completely different version of Anthony Howard Stark than you were before, and he sort of superficially resembles Tony Stark, but in point of fact, you're dealing with a completely different character that is totally divorced from the 50 plus years of continuity that have been established for Anthony Stark.
Okay, we've established that, but would you have any problem connecting with these characters if they were suddenly changed?
If this is where just simply having read so many comics over the years, if you were to say that there is now a version of the Marvel Universe where all the superheroes you like are black, no, I would not necessarily have a problem with connecting of them.
Yeah, I think.
But if you were to say that the mainline version of Tony Stark is now black, well, how did that happen? And what does that mean exactly? Would be a lot of questions that I would have.
Well, here's the problem that I have with that general anti-SJW critique. You say, okay, you're introducing black characters, or you're making current black characters overshadow white characters, or you're race switching characters that currently exist. You can have that perspective that, okay, you shouldn't care where the race of the character you're currently watching. You should be able to connect. But then there's a problem. I have a serious problem when, at the moment, okay, a black character is introduced, or in the case of Riri Williams, when it looked like Riri was replacing Tony Stark, which is an unreasonable thing to think. You could see a lot of the critique, especially Richards, was, oh my god, forced diversity. They're bringing a black chick and replacing Tony Stark. I have a problem with that, because you can say, okay, you should be able to connect with literally any character, and I understand having an attachment to Tony Stark himself, but Comicsgate shouldn't have a problem with these characters just because, okay, it's just like Cena Grace. I can understand that, it's just like Iceman. I can understand that Cena Grace made Iceman an asshole. But if you watch every single diversity in comics video on Iceman, you could see him harping on, oh, forced diversity, you just make this character gay to appeal to SJWs. If a character is gay, but he's a normal person, he's just a gay person, you should be able to connect with that character. I'm not saying every other critique is incorrect, but that particular critique, it really irritates me. Because then why do you have a problem with a gay Iceman?
Well, and and this is Bendis' fault, which so much of this can come down to Brian Michael Bendis. But, Brian Michael Bendis literally said that he established that all of the heterosexual relationships that we have seen Bobby engage in all these years were a lie, basically, that all this time he was actually gay. And there's no, once again, right? So by doing that fairly seemingly subtle shift, Brian Michael Bendis completely changed the character of Iceman. So when you talk about, forced diversity, that's the kind of thing you're talking about. It's like Brian Bendis, for whatever reason, felt that there needed to be a gay character that had always been a part of the X-Men. Never mind that there's North Star, who has been openly gay for a long time and is part of the X-Men. But you have Iceman, and he's gay, quote unquote, and he's part of the X-Men. It was very important to him that happened, and there's no good reason for that. So you have completely changed this long-standing character for no real reason other than apparently to fit your, and this is what I was talking about diversity being a loaded word, to fit your progressive agenda. So I think when people talk about forced diversity, that's what they need to kind of focus on. And I agree that a lot of people don't, that they talk about any attempt at diversity as being quote unquote forced diversity. But ultimately, when you're completely changing well-established characters and their entire history, their entire 50-plus year history that was initially established by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, then yeah, that's kind of a problem.
Okay, you talk about okay, the issue is sorry, this is my first time doing this. I'm very easily exhausted. You spoke about diversity. I think I've forgotten the word you used. Is it them shoehorning, or earlier you said, okay, the point of this was replacing the white characters, or making sure there are less white characters or less straight characters or less male characters, and that being kind of the political ideology or the ulterior motive behind creating all these changes we've seen in Marvel. Why is that a problem?
Well, it's a problem to people that have been reading comics for a long time, and you're basically saying that, oh, all of these elements about these characters that you liked, well, it turns out that they were, problematic and politically charged, and so we're going to change them to fit our own political ideology.
Yeah, but this is just one character. Okay, we understand. I think we both know what Marvel is trying to do. They're trying to increase the amount of gay people in the X-Men or in the Marvel universe in general. We can understand that. Why is that a problem?
I mean, once again, right? This is what I talked about in the video about brand loyalty and about caring about the intellectual property that they put out. It's like you have Brian Bendis and Cena Grace and all the other people involved with that decision completely changed Bobby's character throughout 50 plus years of continuity now, because they wanted to increase the visibility of gay people in Marvel Comics and in the X-Men in particular. So it's if you actually cared about Bobby, like Bobby Iceman, he used to appear on the old Adventures of Spider-Man TV show back in the late 80s, and there was no question that he was heterosexual. But if you like that version of the character, well, that version of the character is gone. Now he's a closeted homosexual. So if you don't care about, the long-standing history of these IPs, then yeah, I suppose it's not a problem. But if you actually do care about the long-standing history, then why would you change these things instead of creating new characters that sort of fit these molds that you're trying to put together?
See, that's where I disagree. You say, okay, if you care about these characters, you'd care that, okay, they remain in continuity, they remain consistent over time, and you don't change things arbitrarily, right? That's what you said.
Okay.
I don't think caring about the character as involves any. Look, here's the thing: Marvel are trying to increase the amount of gay representation in comics, and they don't want to start from scratch, because then you have to build a character up. It's just like the Silencer. The Silencer isn't doing as well as diversity in comics. Sorry, Richard hoped it would. This is a new character, and it's good that they're building her up. And I do think you should build new characters up. But you still haven't told me what the problem is. Like, there's the character of Iceman, like Cena Grace. I think if Cena Grace wrote a straight up character who wasn't obnoxious, I can understand why Iceman is obnoxious in the story, but it doesn't change the fact that he's obnoxious. But if we remove that part of it from the equation, Iceman being gay doesn't destroy anything about the character. Sure, it means that, okay, Marvel has a lot of work explaining how this serial womanizer turned out to be a closeted homosexual. But I think that's an exciting avenue to explore. Nothing about the character's sexuality. His sexuality isn't his defining feature, such that if you change it, suddenly the character is permanently ruined or the character is unacceptable. It just means that someone else, some gay boy somewhere else, some gay guy can look at this character and, in a sense, project his emotions at this character and gain some kind of courage from this character. And this is a character he's liked, or his parents have liked, or his older brothers or his friends have liked for years and years. I don't see what the problem is. I can understand, okay, being a bit salty that, dude, you changed the character we like. That's kind of messed up. But I don't think the reason that Comicsgate or the people who are generally against these changes, I don't think they're sufficient enough. Being gay turning him gay. Sorry, explain to me how turning him gay destroys some fundamental part of his character. I don't want to mischaracterize you.
Well, I mean, for one thing, right, just the fact that all of the relationships he's had, and I don't know exactly how many there's, I'll admit, I'm not a big Iceman fan, I'm not a big X-Men fan in general, but just the fact that all these various relationships he's had, including with Kitty Pryde and etc., that those are all seriously put into question now. The spin on them is completely different. But then, just in addition to that, I mean, its sexuality is something that's fundamental to a person, right? So all of the stories with Iceman now have to be viewed in the light of him being a repressed homosexual. And another thing that you're talking about is just the fact that, you know, you're absorbing, or you're talking about how Stina Grace wrote him as an asshole, which is true. I mean, that's another thing about the SJW and the progressive mentality. And I don't use these things lightly. People, you know, use the word SJW to describe anything they don't like a lot of times. I mean, just earlier today, I was described as an SJW for some fucking stupid thing. But SJW has a very specific meaning, that it's a hard left progressive invested in identity politics. And so when you introduce this element to the character of him being a repressed homosexual, you give license to somebody like Sina Grace to write him like a complete psychopath. So there's the other element there, which is that this element of...
I don't see how that follows.
I mean, yeah, it's hypothetically possible that the story of Iceman being a repressed homosexual could be a really great, groundbreaking story on the level of Neil Gaiman's Sandman, hypothetically. But the problem is that if you're saying that the lack of diversity in comics in general is a problem, so when you introduce diversity, that gives you a license to do things that go against the grain of this non-diverse mindset that don't actually resonate with people. They're not actually well written. They're not actually good. It's just that it's not, you know, it's diverse, quote unquote. It's falls in line with this progressive mindset. So it's basically a license to allow mediocrity and allow people to do really stupid shit with these long established intellectual properties, simply because it's now diverse where it wasn't before, supposedly. Yeah. So that's if anything else, that's the biggest sin of this whole forced diversity.
Okay, you spoke about identity politics, and I'd like to address that a bit later. What you're saying is, okay, exposing Iceman to this, changing Iceman's sexuality at the to satisfy these specific demographic of people we call the SJWs. It opens a gate for them to inject their usual tricks or whatever into the character. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's a bit of a stretch.
I mean, I can show you the Iceman Volume 1 paperback as of my position.
Okay, I want you to give a few examples, like, of something they could do to Iceman that you would find unacceptable or reprehensible?
So, I mean, if Iceman had secretly been a agent of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants this entire time,
Come on.
and like all the shit he did to fight the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and Magneto, if it turned out that that was all just some kind of like really, really in-depth false flag operation, and now he turns against the X-Men, that would be stupid.
Sure, but
It,
no, I'm asking for something something specific to SJW. You're saying them tinkering with his sexuality is going to open the door for them to tinker with other things. Isn't that what you're saying?
nah, I'm not sure about that.
But then
I'm just saying it gives them. I'm just saying it gives them a license for mediocrity.
Yeah, but
And this is
I
where
don't see how that follows. They changed
I mean,
sexuality to
well,
appeal to gay people, to basically give gay people a gift. I don't see how that translates to, okay, now his writing is going to be mediocre.
and this is where the virtue signaling thing comes in, and this is another term that has been very, very abused.
I finished mine.
Yeah, a lot of people use this word, and they don't realize that it's an actual, psychological thing, where people, when you're virtue signaling, and it doesn't matter what group you're a part of, anti-SJWs virtue signal all the time, right? So it's not like it's some crazy, out there idea. It's a psychological phenomenon that got picked up by the right wing anti-SJW blogosphere to describe SJWs, and it does. There are elements to it that make sense, but it's what I said, right? If your thesis, if your idea is that the entire history of mainstream American superhero comics has been problematic, it's only been for white males, then you open the door to any story that is written ever that goes against that grain, regardless of how good it is on its own merit, that it should be respected just simply because it's trying to do something new. Whereas the average person that reads it is going to judge it whether it's a good story or not. If it does something new, great. If it doesn't do something new, but it's still a good story, great. But if you're just simply doing this thing where you're hiring people or you're telling stories that are against this supposedly regressive notion of anti-diversity of the straight white male, if a story is against that, then that's where you give credence to supporting this notion that people can tell any kind of story that's against that, and it's immediately worth looking at just simply because it goes against that historical idea.
Again, I don't think that follows. I think you're taking really large leaps, and I'm not comfortable. Okay, let me see. Let me try repeat your ideas back to you, and let me see if I'm somehow getting it wrong.
Okay.
You think that changing Iceman's sexuality is in a sense, I don't think I have the word. I think the word is like a cop out or a lazy attempt at character development with the aim of appealing to gay people. Is that true? Is that what you're saying?
Not just gay people, but people who consider themselves what you would call allies of the LGBT movement.
Of course. But you think it's a lazy attempt that doesn't do the character justice, and therefore, I'm trying, and therefore that one act opens the character up to a bunch of other lazy actions, like if he was a female, probably turning him into a lesbian dance theory major, whatever. That's what you're saying, right?
I am saying that it opens the door to that, yeah. I'm not saying that it necessarily follows. I'm saying that that is what has happened over the past, since 2014, 2015, that time frame.
We might have to discuss that, but I don't think it follows at all.